and welcome to my latest video. In this video I'm going to be showing you how to paint the Tau special character Darkstrider, which Games Workshop sent me for free as a review copy. You can see I've already primed it black, it's completely stuck together. The only part that isn't glued on is a small section of wall that goes on the base at the back. You can just see it there in the official artwork behind his leg. I left that off because otherwise it's very difficult to paint the model, the back section of the model. Now I'm just going to leave it off completely. I didn't particularly like it, but if you do want to add it on, then I still strongly suggest that you leave it off from being glued on until after you've painted the rest of the model, because as I said, it does make it quite tricky to get the brush on his the back of his leg. So to start with, I'm using two main colours. So if you look at the top left there on the wet palette, the two top colours are XV88 and Macragge Blue. Now what I'm going to be doing is, because this character is supposed to be a sort of stealth specialist, I'm going to make him look very dark and moody with his colour scheme. So the colour placement and colour choices are very similar to the official artwork, but the mood and atmosphere is going to be quite different because the official artwork is very bright and clear, so you can see the model really nicely. In this case, mine's going to be much more dull and desaturated with a few highlight points to sort of suit his stealthy nature. Now, the XV88 and the Macragge Blue that I'm applying, they've both been mixed with German grey. Now you don't have to use German grey, you can use like any kind of dark grey colour that you have, but if you look on the wet palette, so the top two colours, the blue and the the XV88, they're that's straight from the pot, but below that there's the same two colours mixed with a small amount of German grey, and then below that they're mixed with around about 50-50 German grey to the base colour, so whichever one you're using. And those are the first two colours that we're using. So, third one down from the top two colours, so that's what we use to fill in the base for the blue and the armour for the brown. Also, so you can see at the very bottom there on the left, there's Neutral Grey by Vallejo. I'm using that to block in anything that's going to be white in the future. So as you can already see, the model is still really, really dull. And very heavily desaturated. What you'll actually find is when you've blocked in everything that it's probably, you feel like you've done quite a lot of work blocking in all the colours, and it looks really dull and boring. But don't worry about that. It's quite important at this stage to get those colours blocked in. It will make it much easier with the highlighting process to have these more dull colours on there. The final colour that I'm just going to block in is German grey at the bottom. So bottom right there, and anything that's black on the model is going to be highlighted with this as a first stage highlight. So this is different to the other colours that have been painted on. So where I've painted on the German grey mixed with XV88 or mixed with Macragge Blue, those have just filled the whole space of whatever colour I want them to be. With the German grey on the black, this is a stage 1 highlight. So that just means that I've blocked in where the highlight placement goes, and I've left like the sort of shadowy areas as black. Now, don't go too crazy with the German grey, because if you just fill in the whole area, then you end up with grey instead of black. But just try. So what I do is I hold the model under a lamp, see how the light hits it, and then just block in roughly around that sort of area. However, if you do go too a bit excessive really with how you put the highlights on, don't worry about it, because it's very easy. So if you see on the far left of the wet palette there, I've got some black paint. I can just go back with the black paint, knock back any of these grey highlights if they take up too much space, which I do actually do later on, because the trousers do end up looking a bit too grey. So yeah, but it's pretty straightforward. The only other thing is, so when I'm painting this, I'm looking at a front angle for these first primary stage 1 highlights for the grey. However, remember to turn the model around and paint it from the back, doing the same sort of process. Like for the stage 1 highlights, it doesn't matter about which is the brighter area, where the light source is coming from. It just means it's a little bit easier when you paint that next stage highlights in the future. Because obviously when you're looking at a model, they'll, like, if it was based in reality, there'd be like 1 or 2 light sources or whatever, and some areas will be a lot darker and things like that. But in this case, so I am having like the front be obviously the main focal point, which, you know, generally that's what you want to do when you're painting a model. The most important angle is the front facing angle. But you know, you've got to paint the sides and the back as well. So you know, just make sure that you still rotate it around and block in some of those highlight placements. You don't have to take the highlights up quite as much, or maybe on the back not even spend as much time blending everything together. But you know, if you just at this stage, if you just make sure everything's blocked in, it means that the process is a lot quicker and easier as you go along. So here we start with the actual highlighting of the armor. So remember, the first stage was just to completely block in all of the armor with XV88 mixed around about 50-50 with German grey or whatever dark grey colour you happen to have. Now it's kind of like mostly XV88 with just a small amount of German grey. If you find when you start applying this stage highlight that the tonal jump between this highlight and the base colour is too bright, so you know it doesn't look like it's going to blend very nicely, then you know, don't feel constricted by the mixes that I've put on the palette. You can add more intermediate mixes or kind of like bridges of colour. So you know, the more the better in terms of being able to create a nice smooth transition. It just depends on how many you feel you need. Now the consistency of the paint is around about 50-50 water to paint. You know, although do test it yourself, because like each paint pot is different, and you know, depending on how it's evaporated and things like that. So you know, always check your paint before you apply it to the model, like, you know, if you run it on your thumb or on a tile or whatever, just to check the consistency. But you do want a certain level of thinness for the paint when you're doing this, because that will the translucency helps with the transition. So you put one layer down, it looks a little bit thin and watery, and a bit patchy as well, but that's just because it's wet. As it dries, it'll become duller and, you know, mix in better with the background layer. But the background layer will still show through with just one layer of paint. And then as you add more layers, your second stage of highlight becomes more opaque. But you don't have to just completely block in the whole area. You know, do multiple highlight layers over the same area. You can make that area a little bit smaller each time, and what that means is you're creating a transition using the translucency of the paint rather than adding brighter colours of paint on top. Also, the nice thing about having the wet palette is that obviously you have the paints all there ready. So if you make a mistake or you find that a section hasn't blended so much, you can go back to the previous stage colour that you've used, and you can actually dip your paintbrush into the previous colour without taking the paint off that is already on it, and then when you apply it to the model, it will mix together on the model, which will also help get a really nice transition. One of the things, so hopefully you're looking at the marks I'm making on the model there, when you're applying the highlight, push the paint towards the highest highlight area. Don't paint away from it, especially with the thinner paint, because what happens is where the brush touches the model, you leave a certain amount of paint, and then where you remove the brush from the model, it leaves more paint, like a little blob. And there's actually more paint where the brush leaves the model, unless you've completely overloaded the brush, in which case you made a big mistake. But if there's just a reasonable amount of paint on the brush and it's quite watery, where you remove the brush from the model, that will be the largest deposit of paint. So if you paint away from the highlight point when you're doing it, you'll actually end up with a gap between where the highlight is supposed to go and where it transitions into the shadow. So always paint towards the highlight when you're highlighting, and the reverse is true if you're painting in shadows. If you're using a dark, you're painting something to be darker, always paint towards the darkest point. I say always, like you're bound to be watching the video, and at some point or whatever, I'll do something a little bit different and not follow my own advice. But it'll just be a case of that I'm pushing around the pigments a little bit, or like it's a tricky angle on the model to get. Sometimes you kind of like have to adapt to whatever the situation is. So if it's like a really tricky area, like difficult to reach recess on the model, sometimes the brush strokes that you can make are kind of limited, and you just have to do what you can to get paint on the model in those parts. So now I'm on to another stage highlight. So this is actually just pure XV88 now. You can see the marks that I'm making are a little bit sort of stabby with the paintbrush. It's because the area that I'm highlighting is very small now. And just to take that into account, like, don't look at the little measuring thing in the background there. So those are centimeters, but there's a big gap between where I'm holding the model and the measure in the background. So this model is actually only around about 3 centimeters tall, something like that. He's really, really tiny. So just take that into account with these little highlight marks, so you don't have a lot of space to paint these highlights in. But so as I said, I'm using just pure XV88 at the moment. The brush that I'm using is a size 00 Artist Opus brush, but this particular one is an old one that is a bit worn down, and I've cut some of the bristles off, so it's kind of like thinner than it should be. But that's not a problem for me. Like I kind of like quite thin, long brushes. Lots of people will tell you that they'll say, oh, you have to use a small brush to paint details and things. That's not true. You don't have to. You can use a large brush as long as it has a sharp point. And then other people will tell you, oh, you don't need to use a small brush at all. Use a size 2 or 3. You can paint everything with a size 2 or 3. Maybe you can, but don't feel bad if you want to use a small brush. It doesn't matter. Just paint however like it suits you. I prefer to use a thinner, smaller brush unless it's like a large area or I'm painting like glazes or something like that. I just find that I have a lot more control. But the main thing that I find is I can see much more clearly the area that I'm painting, because a big brush blocks more area, and I'm less likely to catch like different parts of the model, other details with the belly of the brush. Because I do find that quite often when I'm using a fatter brush, that although the details is fine with a nice sharp tip on it, if you've got paint a little bit higher up on the brush as well, just gently nudging the bristles against it is obviously going to leave paint on it, and I don't have that problem with a long thin brush. But yeah, so you can see that the marks that I'm making, they're quite delicate. I'm trying to keep them as strokes rather than stippling. This isn't like a model that I'm painting to be like stippled, but I don't mind a little bit of texture on there. So the transitions don't have to be perfect, and especially because remember the scale as well. So this is very, very heavily zoomed in. But if you saw this in the hand, it looked like a very, very smooth transition. But if you want, you can make it smoother with glazing as well. So if you take the XV88 color and you put it in a well palette, or even just on another area on your wet palette, and you add like 4 or 5 parts water to 1 part paint, so it's really thin, and then using a slightly fatter brush, so basically one that's got a larger belly, larger number of bristles, even if you still want like a sharp tip on it. Like take a small amount of the paint into the brush, rub it off on a kitchen towel, and then you can basically do the same thing. You paint towards the highlight, but you go from kind of like the mid-tone sort of area, so like almost touching the shadows, then up to the highlight, and that will create a very smooth transition. Like it'll just soften all the transitions there. But for the way I'm painting this guy at the moment, I'm not going to bother doing that. I think the transitions are all right. They look all right. If you are interested in how to paint something with stippling as well, I am painting one of the new Eldari XR. Whatever they are, Autarchs, that's it. With mainly stippling, and that's on my Patreon at the moment. But anyway, so now on to the next stage highlight on the armor, and this is XV88, and all I've done is just added white to it in different stages. So in the top left, that's pure XV88. On the right next to it, just a small amount of white. Below it, more white. Below it, more white again. You can take this as high as you want and as many stages as you want, just as long as you get a nice transition in there. but because, so remember, the mood and atmosphere that I want for this is very like a dark and stealthy kind of character. So but I do want some kind of like bright highlight points on it, not too many. So I just want to like focus on the sort of the chest and head area as focal points on the model. So this sort of little chest hair area here, like right next to the neck, this is going to be like the kind of the brightest armor highlight on the model. And the nice thing about this kind of painting is it means you don't have to put as much time and effort into painting every part of the armor to the same level of brightness. So say if you're doing like an heavy metal paint scheme, all the highlights and things are kind of like very even over the whole thing, but the only difference with this is that you're painting in the light volumes of the highlights. So if you see the neck guard and as it goes around onto the chest, it's kind of like a very, very large block of highlight. So in that sense you are painting like a larger area but in a small section, and it has a very similar kind of target, if you like. So you're still making the high contrast and picking out details and things, just that you're not having to pick out quite as many details. You're more focused in the areas that you want to stand out. And you can see I have done a little bit of edge highlighting as well. Now I know some people are very anti-edge highlighting, but the thing is that edges do catch the light more than flat surfaces. So you do need to pick out some edges to make them stand out. But because of the way that I'm painting with light volumes and things, I don't want to paint every edge highlight to have the same brightness. So you can see the lower down highlights, on the lower edge of that circle on his chest. That's just like base XV88, and obviously that still looks brighter against the very dark mix where it's around about 50-50 of German grey mixed with XV88. And the nice thing is as well, so you can see these really bright highlights that I'm putting in now. They almost look white on the model, but obviously you can see on the wet palette they're still sort of a beigey colour. It creates like a super high contrast because the base colours of the armour are still really dark, and they're quite close to the highlights as well. So here you can see I've spent a little bit of time doing other areas of the model with the same colour as the armour. And you can also see, so things like if you look on his arm with his hand that's stretched out with the palm upwards, how I've put highlights on there, but they're not as bright as the chest. Same like with the shoulders and on the gun, things like that. So I'm still keeping the focal point up on towards the head and chest, but all the other armour parts will still get highlights as well. Now throughout the video you're going to see that various parts will be painted and some parts won't be, and as suddenly they'll appear painted out of nowhere. So I'm showing you hopefully enough detail to be able to finish off the whole model, but I'm not showing you every single part of the model because it would be like 6 or 7 hours long, I guess, and no one's got time to watch all that. But now we're on to the face, and so there was the base colour that I went, which was the Macragge blue, and I've that was again mixed with the German grey to get the darker sort of face colour. Now what I found was when I started to add Macragge blue on top of that, the tonal jump was not great enough, and I think what it just meant was that the coverage wasn't that strong. And I wanted to get some kind of sharp marks onto the face just so that I could see what I was doing. Now it doesn't matter if you skip a few jumps. So you can see here I'm actually using the middle blue colour to put in these first highlights, and you might be like, well, look how big a tonal jump that is. That's way too bright for the highlights. But all I have to do is just take the next paint up, which would be the base Macragge blue, or I can even go back to the Macragge blue with some of the German grey mixed in with it, and I just blend it in at the edges, and you do the same process. You're still going to get the transition in there. It just means that you're not working in layers quite as much. So what that'll mean is you have like a slightly more textured look, because every paintbrush mark that you make for these highlights, unless it's completely opaque all over, then the darker base color will show through in some of the sort of the scratchy marks on the face, which is kind of interesting. It makes a different surface to the armor, which is like very smooth. Oh, I say very, like, you know, it could be smoother if I glaze it, like I said, but it looks pretty smooth anyway. Whereas the face, like, is much more textured. Well, it will be anyway. So it'll look like a different material, and I find that more interesting to look at than having everything painted with the same kind of finish, like everything being smooth and, you know, shiny and everything. It can look interesting, I guess, but it just means everything looks the same. So whereas if you have different surface textures and different finishes on different parts of the model, then you have something new to look at depending on what part of the model you're actually paying attention to. For the face, you might find it's a little bit tricky painting the face in terms of you're used to seeing human faces, and this is missing some features and has some new ones added. So it's not quite as natural to paint it straight off. Well, at least I found that anyway, because I'm very used to painting faces, obviously looking at faces, my own face in the mirror even. You know, so instantly I had certain sort of highlight shapes that I wanted to paint onto the face, and they don't actually match. So just be aware of that. If you are used to painting faces, you do have to take a moment to actually consider what the model looks like and not what you think it should look like. This is particularly true around the cheek and the nose, and that kind of area. I am doing the same sort of thing again, where I'm holding the model under a lamp and I'm looking where the highlight points go. But the thing with the faces, I want it to be more detailed as well, so I will be kind of like just adding random details on there, and part of that will also be down to the like the marks that the paintbrush makes, like sort of scratchy marks, if I can turn those into like creases or scars or something like that. One thing that you might notice as I progress with the face is that there's quite a strong dark line in between the cheek and what I guess is his nose hole. Now it is sculpted onto the model that there is like a sort of a crevice there. It's not like a very hard crease. But it does curve inwards there. But when I looked at the official artwork, it didn't really show that strongly there. So I guess that they just sort of like painted it as like a lighter color all over. And when I looked at it, I did show a picture of this on my social media as a work in progress, and I was paying attention to it, and like the face, the cheek just looks kind of sort of cute and rounded with how I painted it on. He didn't look mean enough for like a soldier, like a stealth assassin soldier person. So I decided to fill that crease in with a lighter color, and it made a really big difference for how he looks. I don't actually show doing that in the video, but you will see at some point a jump where his face will suddenly look a little bit different. But the process that I use to paint it here is going to be the same. That, you know, I just add, you know, go back and make little changes and things, but you know, all the little brush marks and things like that, it's all the same kind of thing. So hopefully you'll be able to still replicate it if you just pay attention to how I paint these highlights on. If you saw there, just before I took the brush away, there was a tiny little bobble of paint on the tip of the brush. That's something to be aware of. So the paint dries on the tip before it dries anywhere else on the paintbrush. And if your paintbrush gets dry like that, you will get that little kind of bobble of paint. If you see that, it's time to wash your brush off. Thing is, it can be a little bit confusing, because what happens is the paint on the rest of the bristles is still wet, but that bobble will get in the way of the paint flow. In the worst case scenario, the bobble will come off on the model, and then it can dry on there along with the wet paint that you're applying with the brush stroke, and then you've now added a horrible little texture mark onto the model as well. So just be aware of that. And if you see that, what actually might happen is that when you wash the brush off, because the paint is dried on the tip, the bobble might still be there, so you might have to pull that off with your fingertips. So again, just be aware of those kind of little things. It mainly just comes from trying to paint too much without cleaning your brush off and getting more paint on it. Now, if you're continually adding paint to the brush, that will stop to a certain extent the continual drying on the tip, but it will still build up. So you do have to make sure that you wash your brush off every now and then, even if you're just using the same color over and over. So you can see here, as I've added the extra layers on top, that's what I was talking about with some of the sort of texture details in terms of the paint showing through the different layers and then making them into details on the skin. So you can see, like on the cheek as it goes back, there's little dimples and things there, and then you can turn those into sort of like a 3D effect. If you paint the lower edges on them, they'll look like they're actual indentations in the model. I think one thing that I didn't do on this that I wished I had done was to go and study some of the artwork that Games Workshop had of Tau warriors, so I can see what the face structure is actually supposed to be like, because you can make such a huge difference to how a face looks with how you place the highlights on and which areas get filled in. So I was just kind of like relying on the sculpt a little bit on this to decide what the model should look like, whereas you can get a much better feeling. Like ideally you'd use photos, but in this case there are obviously no photographs like of real world Tau, so paintings and like on codex covers, that kind of thing, those are going to give you the information that you need for painting in those sort of extra details. Also at this stage, what I actually do is I paint the eye in the same colour as the flesh around it. I wasn't sure what colour the eye was supposed to be, and as far as I'd seen on some of the Tau models, people had just left them with white eyes, and so I thought maybe they just have like a lens or something, like a layer like dogs have them and things, but a layer that goes over your eyes. But then I saw the Tau animation on Warhammer Plus, and the Tau had black eyes with yellow irises, and I was like, oh, that's quite different to how I've painted it. So I actually go back, and when you see the photo at the end with the finished piece, you'll see that I've actually changed the eyes again, painted them black again, then put a yellow iris on. I'm still not entirely sure what colour they're supposed to be, but I'm assuming the animation is correct. But paint the eyes whatever colour you want. I've seen other people paint this model with like vastly different eye colours. I guess maybe they're like humans as well. They could have all sorts of different eye colours anyway. But I had not seen before that Tau had black eyes, where the whites of human eyes would be. So you can see I'm still building up the layers as well. It's quite a slow process, but it's worth spending time on the face. Like the face is the thing that everyone is going to look at and judge the harshest if you don't get it right. So it is really worth spending. Like in some certain cases, like if you're doing a Golden Demon model, you could spend like, I don't know, a good chunk of the total time that you spend on the model on just painting the face, because it is such an important part of a model. Now in this case, because this isn't a Golden Demon entry or anything like that, not for competition, but it's still like a reasonably high level piece, then it's still, people would look at that and look at the face first. Now I could, if I wanted, spend even more time on the face, but there are limits to how much time you spend painting on certain areas, and because this isn't an army that I collect, I just found this model interesting, so I thought I'd have a go at painting one. I hadn't painted a Tau warrior before. I painted one Tau suit, whatever they're called. I painted one of those before, and that's all the Tau I've ever painted. So I thought it'd be interesting to give this guy a go. And you can see the marks I'm making still. There's still those sort of squiggly, almost chaotic, the marks that I'm making. But remember, it's a very small area that I'm applying it to. So you have to be quite controlled in how you do it. There is a certain element of muscle memory when I'm doing this. Obviously, I've painted for a long time and have a good bit of experience. So you might find it's a bit more tricky to do those marks. But it is worth the practice to be able to get these like different surface textures and things, to be able to kind of like randomly squiggle the brush around. So what I'm doing here, just off the bottom of the wet palette, unfortunately I didn't catch it on the camera screen, is I'm applying some grey onto the model. I'm just taking away a little bit of the blue, just desaturating it down a bit. Ultimately I decided it wasn't necessary, and I could have just left it with the blue. It's entirely up to you if you want to do this or not. I don't actually spend enough time blending it in. So despite all of what I just said about making sure you spend enough time on the face, I could go back and spend a bit more time and actually do it properly. Now I'm adding the grey to it, but I just felt at the time when I was doing it the face looked a little bit blue, but then afterwards I thought, well, actually no, it was fine. And if I just carried on with the highlighting, you're still desaturating it. So remember, there's white paint added to the Macragge blue for the different stages of highlights. The more highlight layers you put on, the less blue there is, because there's more white. It's pretty obvious, but I just felt like with the other colours on the model, because everything is being desaturated on it, that the face was standing out maybe a bit too much. But in hindsight, it's really not necessary to put the grey on here. But then again, if you like it, don't feel like you can't do it just because I'm saying that I wouldn't bother doing it this time. You can see how I've painted the eye in as well. So it's a very bright, it's like the highest bottom right hand colour there, which is mostly white with a bit of the blue mixed in. Here I've spent more time on the face again. I went back around the eye, painting some more details. So as I said, there would be time skips and things on this where I paint a little bit more of the model. But the eye still isn't painted in. But I thought that was the eye after seeing how other people have painted it. Like for the finish, I thought that Tau had white eyes, but anyway, regardless. So on the back here, I'm just going to show you how to paint another piece of the armor. So there are flat panels on the armor. The flat panels are not as easy to paint as curved panels. So you see on the chest when I highlighted that up. That was really easy because the highlight placement is very obvious on the curve. The light catches it nicely. You get a nice bright shine on the model. It's just really easy, especially if you're painting like a shiny surface, if you want to do a non-metallic element. Anything with a curve on it is much easier to paint. If everything has flat panels, then you kind of are stuck a little bit because you don't get as much shine. There's not enough options for shine. You can have edge panels and edges here, like I'm just picking out, but the actual panel itself is very kind of dull. What I'm doing to make it more interesting, and this is kind of like common, like a common style of painting. It's not super realistic, but it's modulation. All it is just having light next to dark, and so, but in a transition. So you see at the top of the panel, it's dark. It goes down. Further down the panel you go, it's light. It's not anything particular about how the light is catching the model. And indeed, if you just looked at it from a realistic point of view, using the light from the lamp hitting it, it's probably all going to be almost just one colour there if you filled it in. And you can do that as well, as long as you paint in the edge highlights brighter and things, it will stand out nicely. But I just felt like a bit of modulation would be more interesting on these panels, especially because then it matches the front a bit more with the transitions going on. Because if you just with a flat panel, if you're not getting any transition, it's kind of like a flat color, whereas you do get the transitions on the curved surfaces. So sometimes realism works, sometimes it doesn't. But I like to kind of just vary it a bit just to make it more interesting. But if it's has enough things that are close enough, then then it'll all work together, hopefully. So now I'm going to paint the trousers a little bit. Now the thing with painting black surfaces is you have to be really careful, because if you paint too much grey, then it obviously becomes grey. So you're going to be focusing on a much smaller area of highlight. Best advice I can give for this is to get reference. So like if you want shiny leather, then look for a black leather photograph, something like that, and see how light works with the surface. Because if you highlight this the same way that you've highlighted the armor, as I said, you just basically have a grey surface. But the thing is, you do have to get the highlights on. Now, the shinier you want it, the shorter the transitions between the highest highlight and the darkest shadow. So if it was kind of like almost a mirror finish, but in black and white, then it would almost just go instantly from black to white. And then the more matte the surface becomes, then the softer the transition. It will spread the highlight out more, and it becomes softer and softer, and then a very matte surface, it's hard to make it black, because the light is sort of like diffused over the whole surface. Whereas if it was like a very glossy black surface, then the light tends to almost just reflect the shape of the light, and the rest of the surface just sort of like stays black. But again, on this, don't worry too much if you over highlight it. So you put too much grey on there, because all you have to do is take something like a Baden black and turn it into a glaze, which again you can do in a well palette or on the wet palette. Just take a bit of black, mix it in with 4 or 5 parts water to 1 part paint, and then load up your brush, rub it on kitchen towel or whatever, and then gently go from kind of like close to the highlight that you want to keep, and then glaze into the shadows, towards the shadows, and that will knock back a lot of the highlight, and then you'll be left with just the bright highlights that you want, and it'll make the surface look much darker. And also the nice thing is it doesn't mean that you just get like a massive tonal jump going from a bright white grey to black, because having the glaze on allows you to control how the transition looks. So you'll still get that soft transition at the very edge of the highlight, while still making the majority of the area that you want to be dark look black. For all the greys that you see on the palette there, I mixed all these myself. So I just put some black down each time, then added a bit more white to each mixing. The reason I did that is because I constantly tell people it doesn't matter which colour grey that you have, unless you want like very subtle variations with like warmer or cooler greys or whatever. But if you something like German grey, if you can't mix it, you can't buy it yourself, you just mix it. So as I said, I just took a load of variations between black and white, mix them all together, so I have a nice lot of steps for the transition. I actually did way too many, don't need all these variations, but they're there if I find that I need them. Like sometimes if you are painting an area and you can't quite get the transition right, you've got the little bridge highlight in between that you just help you to blend it in at the edges. This highlight that I'm putting on the hair, so obviously the hair is staying kind of black as well, but this is quite an important part, quite an important highlight on the model, because again, face and head are focal points, and I want the hair to look different to the trousers, the pant sort of area. Now, even though I was talking about the brightness of the highlights and things on there, the highlights on the material on the trousers is still quite dull. Like I haven't taken the highlights very bright, and I haven't made the bright highlights very large. So I just haven't over highlighted them. Basically, I've only gone up to around about neutral grey at the highest point, and even then it was a fairly thin layer of paint, so the darker paint below is still coming through. Whereas on the hair here, I want the hair to be kind of like shinier. So I'm taking the highlight higher, but the final highlight is a larger block as well. So what you might sometimes find when people highlight things is every time they do another highlight layer, they make it like super thin, and like the final white highlight might be just like a very thin line going over a surface. But that's not always correct, because the shape of the surface that the highlight is hitting determines the shape of the highlight, and can also determine the size of the highlight. Like, it's a bit of a balance between the material, the light source, and the shape of the highlight. So it gets a bit complicated, but like, generally speaking, if you want something to be shinier, then the bright highlight that you want it to be quite a big bright highlight, unless you just want it to be a very small light source. So it's like it'll be like a little pin dot or something like that. But otherwise it will be the final highlight is quite a big block of highlight, and then you just get the transitions at the very edge of the highlight. So you can see on the hair, where the curve is, there's quite a large highlight there. Now, I haven't taken it up to pure white, but it's still quite a bright highlight, and it's a big block. The other thing to pay attention to on that highlight there on the head is that, so on the hair sculpting, there are strands of hair. So these strands, they'll be big clumps, kind of like dreadlocks almost, all bound together. But because of that, there's big recesses in between each clump or strand of hair. And the temptation will be just to pick out the raised parts of the detail and leave the recesses darker. But that will then not look natural, because if the light is coming from directly above there, the light is still going to hit into the recesses. So you want to fill in the whole area. Like, you can pick out the raised bits a little bit towards the very end of the highlight stage, so some stand out more than the recesses, but you don't want a big tonal jump between the recess and the raised point, because it's too high a contrast and it doesn't look natural. Whereas if you kind of fill in the recesses with highlights up to, but not including the final stage highlight, then you'll still get the detail of them. The raised area will still be a little bit lighter than the recess, but the light is still hitting from the same direction, so it would get into those recesses. Hopefully that makes sense. Here's just a quick show again of some more modulation on the white armor panel, and you also get a lovely view of some of my hair getting in the way. The only problem, like, I wanted to show this a little bit. So painting white is a little bit more tricky than other colours, because the pigment in white paint is just larger than the other colours, and what that means is you tend to end up with a more chalky finish. It's very easy to get something that doesn't look smooth. So the easiest way to paint something white is actually to go in reverse. So you paint it white to start with, not on a black primer base coat. So if you're painting a model that all the armour is white, it's best to not start from a black primer, because it's just a lot of effort. But regardless, if you want to, like, an easy way of painting white, you paint the whole area sort of white or an off-white. Like, off-white is easy to paint than pure white, because it has some of the darker pigment particles in, so it actually works out that it makes it a little bit smoother. But if you paint it white to start with, and then you work backwards by adding darker colours to it for each stage, then it's easy to get a smoother finish. The only tricky part is the very first stage of getting a smooth white finish on the bright parts to start with. But doing it like this, the other thing is, because you're painting like a really light colour on top of black, and with the translucency of the paint, you have to do multiple layers. So you do run the risk of very easily making, as I said, like a sort of a chalky, thicker textured finish. So you do have to keep the paint quite thin when you're doing this, and it might get a bit frustrating because the paint's thinner than you want it to be to make the hard mark. Also, I'd suggest using a thicker brush than I have for this. So I was talking earlier about using thinner brushes. In this case, a thicker brush will give a better result, because you can cover the whole area in like one stroke, and that then decreases the chance that you're going to corrupt paint that you've already got on the model. And what I mean by that is, if you started to touch the model with a paint, then you move it away, and then you touch the area again, that paint that's already on the model will have started to dry. So if you touch it, you're then breaking the sort of like the surface tension that's already started to dry around the edges and things, and you leave little scuff marks, and they can turn into texture marks as well, so you don't get a smooth finish on the model. All sorts of things like that. If paint has touched a model, ideally you don't want to touch it again. You need to leave it to dry. However, if you put too much paint on the model, then you do need to touch it again to remove some of that paint. But hopefully, if there's too much paint, it stays wet enough that you can get it off in time. Right, so moving on. Just to reiterate, the panel on the shoulder that I was painting white, it's exactly the same process as the other armor panels that are painted with the XV88. Just a different color. It's kind of like modulation, because it's a flat panel. As I said, the curved panels like on the wrists and the chest are way easier to paint. So now I'm just painting the lens. The lens is very quick and easy. I'm using Mephiston red. So that's in the top right hand side there. And what I did was I painted a light dot in the sort of top rightish section, like a little round circle. Then I did an edge kind of highlight all the way around the circle. Then I've got some Sunz Scarlet, and to the left of that, so I just did a little dot on the circle again, and also on the lower edge, and then on top of those I've added a little bit of white each time. Take it up to like a pinky colour. Be careful with these highlights though when you're adding white to it, because obviously this will turn it to a pink colour. Now you can see here the marks that I've made, they're quite small. I've also left it so it's like a black circle in the middle. It looks a bit more like an iris. So I thought that'd be kind of interesting for the the lens on the machine. But the more white that you add, the more pink that it becomes, the less red that is on there. So you've got to keep the highlight areas small and high contrast, so the red is still visible on the edge of the highlights. You saw I just painted a base color there onto the armor of the little drones. So that was again Mephiston red mixed with German grey. So this is where one of the colours where you have to be extra careful, because reds are generally not very good at coverage anyway. German grey is very, very good at coverage. So a small amount of German grey makes a huge difference. But so you can see again on the right hand side, top right, Mephiston red. Below that, small amount of German grey added to it. Below that, it's around about 50-50. But test, and if you feel like you need more stages, then by all means add different like bridge colours in between, just to make the steps easier. The first colour that you applied to the armour panel obviously is the bottom one, the darkest one, and then you're just going up through the different stages, adding more red each time. For these, I don't want them to be over bright, so I don't want the highlights on these to be fighting with the colour of the lens. So even though they're painted the same colour, they don't have the same mixes. So remember, when I painted the lens, I started straight off with Mephiston red, and then I just highlighted up to pink. In this case, the base colour was 50-50-ish Mephiston red with German grey. That's the whole base colour, and then I've highlighted up from that. So that makes a very different final result to the look of the colour. Then for the highlights I'm putting on, so again, as I mentioned, started off with the 50-50, then above that it's mostly Mephiston red with a small amount of German grey added, and you're just picking up the edges of the armour. Again, focus really closely on the part that's closest to the front facing view. You pick out edges and things and like different highlights on other parts of the model of the armour panels, because obviously you need details all the way around it, but the brightest points and the most interesting points, make sure they're facing forwards, because then that allows you to have the sort of like the nice lighting effect and the nice transition into the reds. So you can see there when I highlighted them up, I didn't go much higher than Mephiston red. You can see there's a kind of like a little tiny dot at the front of each one where I just took it a little bit brighter. That just gives a bit of shine to the armour. But I definitely didn't take it up to the pinks, which would have been way too bright. Like the fine little dots on the lens. So the lens looks more shiny than the armour. You can see especially at that top one there, just getting cut off at the top of the screen. How the lens looks a lot more shiny than the armour. So what I'm just going to do here, just for a bit of fun really, so I'm going to paint like a round yellow circle freehand on his lens. So this is like veering quite far off from the official artwork, where they had painted this kind of like I think a turquoise color with some details on, whereas I thought it'd be more interesting to have something that would stand out a little bit more high contrast. So it's just going to be a yellow circle, kind of like more like a gold circle. But the first thing I'm doing is I'm painting it as a black circle, because remember, this is a very small area. It's tricky to get like a very clean circle on such a small area. I strongly recommend that you just use the tip of the brush, and you use a fairly new brush, obviously with a good point. Keep the paint fairly thin as well. You probably want about 1.5 parts water to 1 part paint. I use Vallejo model color black as my preferred black. I find that the opacity of it is really good even when it's thinned, so it flows nicely and you still make a good mark. Keep the circle, you can make it a little bit fat to start with, and then so the base that I painted it was the grey, so you know all the other greys that I've painted on the model is just the same as I've used on the lens here, but I did like a little bit of modulation as well, so it was darker at the top, lighter at the bottom of the lens, and then like an edge highlight to all the way around it, just to define the shape. But I wasn't worried about it being like a very smooth, even transition, because I knew that I was going to paint this black circle on there, and chances are I wouldn't get it perfect. So I could then paint the circle a little bit thicker, and then go back with those grey colours, and then just neaten it up a little bit and try and make it more centralised. Now that's kind of like the hardest bit actually, is to make it like a free floating circle and not touch the edge but be close all the way around while keeping it like circular shape. You'll probably end up with something that looks a bit like an egg when you first try it, but you know, keep at it, and you can keep like, you know, going backwards and forwards, you know, slightly tweaking little bits here and there, and you'll get something that ends up kind of like a circle. The main thing is don't worry about the central shape, it's the outer edges that are more important, because you can always just you know, you can always fill the area with black and then paint a little grey circle in the middle. The reason for the black circle when you're painting the yellow outline, and this is Yriel yellow by the way, is it gives you a very slight high contrast edge inside and outside the yellow circle. Because if you just went and painted a yellow circle on top of the grey background, there's not such a big tonal jump between the yellow and the grey, so the yellow won't stand out as much. Whereas with that sort of black background with a black edge, it's like it defines the shape of it a little bit, and just helps it to stand out that just tiny bit more. Because you know, if you've got to spend a bit of time doing a bit of difficult freehand, you want to be able to see it. Especially because as well, so I picked yellow, which is probably like the worst colour, because yellows just have terrible coverage in general, and they so that they're very translucent, so you see the colour beneath quite easily. So what that means is that you have to go around this circle quite a few times. The tricky part for me on this was that I'm filming this, so like I couldn't quite hold the model in exactly the angle that I wanted it to be to get the easiest movements for me. But you know, it doesn't look too bad. You know, sort of circular-ish. And again, remember, it's very heavily zoomed in, so you know, faults that you can see at this kind of zoomed in level, they don't appear anywhere near as bad when you see them in the flesh. So there you can see I've done a few layers of yellow going all the way around, and then all of all I've done. Sorry, Paul, it wasn't my brain restarting. It was I was waiting to see if I'd actually done it. So on the lens, what I did was I made it kind of like a shiny lens. You can't quite see it from this angle. You'll see it later on. Is I put a little highlight on the bottom edge and then a dot on the top. So kind of like how the lens on the drone looks. You can see how there's a highlight on the bottom edge and a little dot on the top. I've done the same thing on the yellow circle, and that just makes it stand out quite a bit more. So this is the final thing that I'm showing you here. This is just to paint some non-metallic gold onto the model, and it's pretty straightforward. I'm using actually very similar colours that I've already used on the armour, so starting off, it's with the XV88 actually, and all you're doing is sort of blocking in, so. Remember when I was talking about how highlights on different surfaces work differently, and I'm having all the non-metallic gold on this quite shiny. So if you see where the highlight goes on the ones that are already painted, is a big block highlight, and that follows in line with the highlights on the hair as well. You can see these highlights going all the way around. So all of these little rings will be painted the same way. Again, this is different from the official artwork. I think they've painted these as like a red sort of material. I don't know what they are. They might be ribbons for all I know, but they're being golden rings on this. And yeah, so you start off with the XV88. Then I went to Balor Brown and just went over it a little bit the same way. And then Ice Yellow. So they're not quite the same colours as I've already used, but very, very similar. So you can see they stand out. The main thing that's different, though, is the light volumes. That's the size of the highlights. You see how big the bright highlight is. And here you can see the finished piece now. See on those golden rings, the bright highlight is very big and bold. That looks much more shiny than the armour itself. And you can see I've used that same effect on like some of the other little gold bits, like on the gun. Those little shiny parts, and there you can also see what I was talking about, the highlight on the circular lens on his the highlights on the circular lens. So that's the end of this video. Hopefully you've seen enough now that you can replicate a similar sort of thing for your own Darkstrider. Thank you very much for watching. Please remember to subscribe. I have a lot more videos to come. Also, I have a Patreon and my personal webpage, which has some, it has hundreds of hours of video tutorials with high-level painting and things like that, aimed a little bit more at kind of like Golden Demon entries. I am working on the Eldar Autarch, as I mentioned earlier in the video, which is coming along quite nicely now. And I've also got Balor. So those are like my two main focus things to work on for Golden Demon projects. But anyway, that's the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.